Okay, so welcome to the channel. Now in today's video, I'm doing something different. I haven't actually done like a dedicated video on the channel. I normally just stream, but I thought this video was really important to make. So there are a lot of new subscribers to the channel. You might not know who I am. So I have been working in the fashion industry for about 10 years now. I've worked in many different roles, from being a journalist to being in marketing to being on design teams. So I have, over the years, visited many factories all across the world. I work with a lot of luxury brands, and I have in the past. So I have a good understanding of the way that a lot of luxury brands operate. Also, a book all of you need to read, and I talk about this all the time, so much that I might need to get royalties at this point. But How Luxury Lost Its Luster will give you a good understanding of the stuff that I'm going to talk about today by Dana Thomas. Please buy the book or read the book if you don't have it. If you don't like reading, on my Patreon for $3, you can subscribe to my Patreon, and I have a 14-part series on this book, essentially reviewing each chapter and talking about what was mentioned in each chapter. In addition to that, I have also reacted to the Kingdom of Dreams documentary series, which is a 4-part documentary series that is inspired partially by this book. So, now that I've said that, now I just really want to, because I've seen so much misinformation, and even though I kind of debunked a lot of things in my live stream, I think there's still a need for this kind of dedicated video so that this misinformation does not really spread like a virus. I've already seen so much misinformation around this whole China, producing in China conversation, because when something goes past the fashion community, or the people that are covering this story, or people that don't work in the fashion industry or haven't worked in the fashion industry, they don't really know what they're talking about, and it isn't their fault, because how would you know unless you visit the factories, unless you work with the brands, right? Unless you've worked in the fashion industry. The first question, or the first statement that I want to talk about, is this statement that every luxury brand produces in China. So that's the first thing I want to address. Now, fashion, especially luxury fashion, is vast. The fashion industry as a whole is a $1 trillion industry. I think a lot of people see fashion as a frivolous thing, because when they think of, oh, you work in fashion, that must be so frivolous. Lawyers work in fashion, manufacturers work in fashion, leather tanneries work in fashion. You know, every single aspect of any sort of business, there's a version of that in fashion, because it's needed. These are billion-dollar conglomerates, multi-billion-dollar brands like Chanel and Hermes, conglomerates like LVMH and Richemont and Kering. These are this is the scale that we're talking about when we talk about luxury fashion. So no, luxury brands don't only produce in China. I think with these TikTok videos, has led people to believe it's kind of this mentality of, haha, you guys that buy the real thing, shame on you. You know, I could just buy the version in China, because that's where they produce anyway. Now, while it is true that some luxury brands produce in China, not all, and most luxury brands, I don't even think there's even one luxury brand, and I'm talking about the major luxury brands like Prada, Dior, Coach, all these luxury brands. There's not one luxury brand that everything they produce is in China. Like I've said, fashion is vast. There are so many places that fashion brands produce, and I'll mention some of them to you. A lot of fashion brands produce in Portugal, China, Vietnam, Bangladesh, Turkey, the UK, especially areas like Scotland, that's known for tweed. Japan is known for denim, for example, and many other regions like India. There's so many regions that a lot of luxury brands produce in: France, Italy. And every region actually specializes in certain things. So like if you want the best quality denim, you go to the likes of Turkey, or you go to Japan. If you want the best quality knitwear, that's where places like Italy or Portugal come in. So as a brand, you'd see that most luxury brands actually go to where the different specialties are around the world. And that's why you'll see a lot of luxury brands, they produce their denim in Japan, for example. They produce their knitwear in a different country. They produce their sportswear in a different country. China, funny enough, actually specializes in specific things, which is why a lot of luxury brands go there. A lot of luxury brands also build their own ecosystems in China. So they train their own staff to work in their own factories in China. The reason why they go to China mainly is to exploit the lower labor market. That is why. A lot of times you will see that the more complicated bags that brands produce are produced in Italy or France because the amount of training and work that it takes to really train people to build and create these bags is very long. You have to train these people for a very long time. I visited a Celine factory where it takes you 5 years of training before you're allowed to actually work on every single aspect of a bag. So that's kind of what you see produced in Italy, produced in France. Normally, what gets outsourced to the lower labor cost markets are the easier bags to create. Where they can just, train people, but not as long, and they can create the easier products to make. And even that is not a monolith. Some brands even produce their more difficult products in China if the expertise is in those specific partners that they're working with. So every luxury brand does not produce in China. However, a lot of luxury brands do produce in China. And there is this misconception that they produce in China and therefore everything is produced in China. It's not true. It's just not true. It's not reality. It's not fact. I've been to so many luxury factories in the West, whether that's in France, in Italy, where luxury brands are producing garments. That goes into the Hermes thing, right? Hermes does not produce bags in China. Hermes produces their bags in France. A lot of luxury brands, you'll find actually, in luxury fashion, a lot of luxury brands don't like talking about where they produce. They're very secretive because they don't really have a strong hold on their supply chain. So if they were to come out and say, we only produce in this place, or all our stuff is sourced from this place, when they're working with third-party manufacturers and then someone does an investigation and finds that actually you don't produce there, that could be a big dent in the reputation of a lot of these luxury brands, which is why they just try to be secretive and they don't talk about where they produce, just to avoid things like that. I mean, we've seen so many scandals over the years, right? Burberry acting like they're sustainable, then it turns out that they're burning garments. And we've seen so many similar scandals happen at various other luxury brands. The next thing that I want to address is this idea that products made in China are bad quality. I think this is also another misconception. But I do think that some balance needs to be provided in this conversation. So in China, China is a country that has almost made it part of their country's business to be the world's manufacturer. And as a country, when you invest billions into being the manufacturer of the world's products, you have a level of expertise that most other countries don't have. That's why iPhones are made in China. That's why many other high quality products, high quality cars are made in China. There's this misconception that if it's from China, it's bad quality, is just such an outdated and short-sighted way of seeing garments. I have personally worked for luxury brands where the main reason that we produced in China is because no other country could produce that specific item that we wanted to the quality of certain manufacturers in China, because they just have expertise in those specific factories and the training and the software and the machinery to make what we wanted at the quality that we wanted it. So there are many brands that go to China because they actually have the expertise. China and Vietnam actually are very famous in fashion for being quite advanced when it comes to sportswear and technical garments, like a lot of the tech wear garments, those technical like waterproof, color temperature regulating garments. A lot of that stuff is made in Vietnam and China because they have the expertise and they've been making those sort of stuff for many years. That's why people go. Now, on the flip side, this is why I add balance to the conversation. A lot of luxury brands have also gone to these low-cost labor markets solely with the main goal to cut costs. They're not going there because they're trying to seek the expertise of China. They're not going to Vietnam because they're trying to seek expertise. It's solely and wholly to cut costs. Now, when your business model, and this is the case for a lot of these conglomerates that have shareholders that demand every single quarter, there is some sort of financial upward spiral, an uptick in the share price and in profits, they are beholden to their shareholders and therefore they have to cut corners. So going back to this amazing book, How Luxury Lost Its Luster by Dana Thomas, she documents this. This is a book that was first published in 2007, that long ago. In this book, she talks about a lot of things that I'm talking about. She talks about the fact that a lot of luxury brands, the quality was going downhill and they were cutting corners to try and maximize profits. She even gave a story and an example that she bought a pair of Prada trousers in the 90s, and then a few years later she bought another pair of trousers and they ripped and the quality was horrible and the lining was not even substantial, yet it was more expensive. So both things are true. There are certain luxury brands that go to these low labor cost markets to seek the expertise. Also, they're taking advantage of the fact that the labor cost is not as high. But then there are some brands that solely everything they do is to cut costs. They won't put lining because they're trying to save costs. They will use less hardware on the garments because they're trying to save costs. So this misconception that Chinese products are bad quality doesn't make sense because it really just depends on what the goal of the company that goes to China is. If they are going there with the sole thing that give me the cheapest version, I want to maximize profits, they will show you the factory that will make the bad quality products, but it will be cheap. Now, if you go to China with the intention to seek the expertise and go to China specifically for the technological advancements that they have in the garment manufacturing industry and actually benefiting from that, you actually might find that even producing in China would be expensive. And a lot of luxury brands found that producing in China was expensive, once again, mentioned in this book, because that's why they started to diversify away from China and go to even lower labor cost markets like Cambodia and like Vietnam, which was seen as cheaper to produce in than China. So even China, for a lot of luxury brands, is seen as a more expensive labor cost market than maybe people watching this might think to a lot of these companies. So once again, a lot of misconceptions around the expertise that China has. China has insane expertise in garment manufacturing. The quality of garments that they produce is really dependent on the goals that the companies that they work with have. So that's another thing I wanted to address. The third thing that I wanted to address is this idea that Europe is always better, which isn't true. It's true sometimes, but it's not always true. Now, Europe has the expertise on making certain things because certain levels of craft have been passed down from generation to generation. A lot of these historic luxury brands, the Dior's, the Balenciagas, the Chanel's, the Hermes's, are brands that have been around for a long time, and there have been people that have been working for these brands over generations, and they've passed down this level of craft and expertise from generation to generation. There's also a certain pride in places like France and Italy of the garment industry and how important it is to the economy of the country. So people have a certain pride in making these leather goods and crafting and making sure that they maintain a certain level of craft, but they also preserve these techniques for future generations, because this is an industry that is very important to just the history and the pride of these countries. So in that case, like in the case of Hermes that produces in France and very high quality bags, that's kind of where they're going with it. And in their case, producing in Europe is definitely better. Things are above board. The working conditions of the workers are good. The workers are not making these bags in sweatshops. However, that's not the case for every brand. Now, there are some brands that, yes, they produce in Italy, yes, they produce in France, and everything says made in Italy, but actually there have been many investigations, police investigations, journalistic investigations that have found that a lot of brands collaborate with these third-party manufacturers to create some of their garments. Most recently, we saw this with the likes of Dior, where Dior produced their book totes in a third-party manufacturer in Italy. It was found that in this factory in Italy, via Reuters, through a very, very rigorous investigative report, that these factories were actually making use of undocumented workers, illegal workers that don't have rights. When these illegal workers don't have rights, they could get away with making these workers work ungodly hours, hours that are not even legal, working them to the bone, who are they going to report to? If they report, they get deported. So they obviously have no choice. They just have to work, getting paid less than the minimum wage in the country. So everything is illegal. These things are well documented. So two things can be true at once. The same thing with China, that, there are some good quality garments that are made in China, while there are some bad quality garments. There are some brands that go to China wanting to manufacture certain things, and China is the only country that has the expertise. On the other hand, there are brands that go to China and Vietnam and Cambodia that just are going there to exploit the low-cost labor market, and that's it. Same thing with Europe. There are brands that appreciate artisans and the craft, and therefore the bags are really expensive, because that price of having everything above board and paying these artisans is expensive, and therefore they pass it on to the customers. However, there are also other brands in the same France and Italy that are producing with third-party manufacturers that, take advantage of undocumented workers and, these crazy practices, and they look like sweatshops. There's this misconception that sweatshops are only in Asia, but there are sweatshops in Italy and in France also. And there have been so many investigations into this. These are so well documented. I actually cover this on the channel quite frequently. So if you follow this channel frequently, you would know about what I'm talking about. But this is quite common in the fashion industry. So once again, is Europe always better? No. Is an assumption that made in Italy is automatically better than China? That is not true. Or made in France is automatically better than made in China. I think it just depends on all the factors that I've brought to you guys, and I've clearly explained in this video. Another misconception I really want to debunk in this video is this idea that everything in Europe is done above board. There seems to be, and I don't actually know, I need to really look into this, what it's rooted in, that people kind of think that everything in the West is always better than everything in Asia, which is just not true. But I've seen a lot of comments from my coverage of this with people saying, there's no way that anything could be bad in Europe, because in Europe we have to abide by all these laws and blah, 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 blah. But I've just told you all the investigations that have happened in Italy, for example. Like I mentioned Dior, where Dior was using, for lack of a better term, an illegal factory, a factory that was operating with illegal practices. These brands, everything they do is not above board. They will just do what they can get away with. So there's this misconception that, there's no way that anything could be bad in Europe, because everything happens above board and everyone needs to, follow by these auditing processes. And there are many articles, check Reuters once again, talking about the bad auditing system and how it's broken, and explaining quite clearly how it's broken in a detailed way. So once again, huge misconception that everything in Europe is above board and every brand, abides by the law and everything is by law. That's not how it works. That's just not how it works. A good aspect to this whole debacle around China and the whole TikToks that have been produced, I think, has been this understanding that luxury doesn't always mean quality. And I think some of you will know this, but this is also something I want to mention. There seems to be an assumption with a lot of customers that spending a lot of money means that what you're buying is quality. And I cannot stress to you enough that just because you spend a lot of money on something does not mean that that thing will be high quality. We've seen recently, and I'm bringing these recent examples because these happen all the time, so much so that I can bring you so many recent examples. We've seen examples with Van Cleef & Arpels controversy, that people spend a lot of money, but these products are not, made to be that high quality, because a lot of these brands, they cut corners. They cut corners to maximize profits. Once again, re-referencing how luxury lost its luster. That's the whole point of this book. That's the whole narrative of this book. How brands historically started as brands that were about the craft, and they started with the founders caring about the craft and wanting to dress kings and queens. But as these brands have been bought by business tycoons, by conglomerates, these conglomerates have shareholders that all they care about is their stock prices going higher, the value of their stocks going up. So that has meant that these companies cut corners every which way. So you as consumers need to be discerning and judge products by a case-by-case basis to know what quality is. As a rule of thumb, if what you care about is quality and you don't just care about brands, you can actually go to local artisans and spend less money to get custom-made garments. In places like Florence, for example, which is a place I've been to, they have a lot of craft. I've been to a lot of luxury factories in that Tuscan region. The Tuscan region in Italy is quite famous for having leather tanneries, and they produce they tan a lot of the leather that a lot of brands use across the world. Now, in Florence, there is actually a leather school, and you can go to this leather school and they can make you custom bags. And the cost of these custom bags actually costs less than some really expensive Chanel bags or some really expensive Hermes bags, and they can make them custom. They can, put your own initials into the bag. You can have your own custom design. So once again, if quality is what you care about, there are many places to go for quality and you won't even spend the luxury prices. The same is the case with other categories: belts, shoes, jewelry. There are so many artisans that make bespoke versions of all these things, right? So that's something that I have to point out. If you think that, I spent $10,000 on this bag, so it must be good quality, you will be in for a surprise. You will honestly be in for a surprise. Luxury does not always mean quality. However, some luxury brands are actually good quality. So that's why you have to know what brands are still produce quality and which ones don't. And it's ever changing, which is why as a consumer, you have to really learn what good quality means. What's a good quality leather fabric? What's a good stitch? What kind of garment should they be using? What kind of lining should they be using for a jacket that is supposed to be waterproof, for example? You need to kind of know these things, especially if you're going to spend a lot of money. Of course, however you want to spend your money is your derogative. However, it's my job, I guess, to educate consumers as someone that works in the fashion industry, so you kind of know what you're getting yourself into. If you're just so ultra rich that you can buy all these things and not have the second thought, fair enough to you, congratulations. But, for most consumers, they are not in that position, and therefore that's why I have to explain these concepts to you. The last thing I really want to talk about at length is this whole conversation around, luxury manufacturers are exposing these luxury brands, and I think they are in a sense. And what they are saying is true, that a lot of luxury brands produce in China, which, to my surprise, a lot of people didn't know that a lot of luxury brands produce in China. So I think there has been an education there in terms of luxury brands producing in China. And I kind of like that aspect of it because I want people to know how vast the fashion industry is. People don't know where things are produced, it seems, based on this whole controversy. So it was good that that was created. However, the fashion industry is there's a lot of legality to it. There are so many contracts that people have. And while I agree that a lot of luxury brands manufacture in China, as I've mentioned at length in this video, most manufacturers that produce with luxury brands have to sign contracts that means they can't disclose publicly that they actually produce the luxury brands. So there's a misconception, once again, I think it's a lack of people's understanding of the fashion industry that has led to, there was a guy that had this famous video talking about the cost of, what it takes to create an Hermes bag, and talking about the fact that he can create an Hermes bag to the same quality. A lot of people have misconstrued what he said to mean that, Hermes makes their bag in China, when even he did not say that Hermes makes their bags in China. He actually even said that Hermes, their labor cost is more expensive because they produce in France, which means he literally said Hermes bags are produced in France.
And then the cost of human resource. The French artisans is much more expensive than Chinese artisans. To finish one bag, the human resource cost will be 600 USD.
There are bits of discrepancies in the actual figures of what it costs to make an Hermes bag, and you had the likes of Tanner Leatherstein that debunked that, to be honest. However, I don't know why comprehension is really on an all-time low online these days, where a guy can literally say, in China, we can produce, bags of the same quality, which I definitely believe because I work in the industry and I've seen super high quality bags produced in China. But people take that and they're like, yeah, Hermes produces their bags in China, therefore there's no need to buy Hermes bags. And it's such a big issue, and that has led to a lot of misconceptions. Like, people genuinely think that they're going to call someone a TikTok manufacturer and they're going to be producing with the same manufacturers as Gucci or Dior or Chanel. Like, that's just not reality. They sign contracts, which means that they cannot disclose publicly where they produce. And if they were to disclose it publicly, they would lose their business overnight, because that means they would lose the trust of the brand that they are producing for, and they would seek, a factory elsewhere. That is the reality of what would happen, to be honest. Why I mentioned in my earlier coverage and previous videos that this might lead to a lot of lawsuits is because there are so many defamatory statements about these brands brewing and flying all across social media. And I just wondered, would a lot of these luxury brands want to control the narrative and get on top of this? And how exactly would they do that? So yeah, those are my thoughts on kind of talking about all these different aspects and conversations I've seen around this controversy and this whole TikTok frenzy on social media. So yeah, once again, remember, I'm saying this as someone that has visited many factories across the world. I've worked with many luxury brands. I'm working with luxury brands currently. I've worked with many luxury brands in the past. I've worked in the fashion industry for a very long time. This is not someone that, sits on my bed and just reacts to videos all day and doesn't have any industry experience. So, with that being said, if you guys, there are many people that follow my channel that also work in the luxury industry, please add some of your experience in the chat. I think it would be very educational for a lot of people, especially my new audience that has come in from me covering the China situation and not really knowing much about the fashion industry. I've seen a lot of comments of people saying I'm not really into fashion, but you cover it in an interesting way, and I like that, to be honest. But this could be a teaching moment rather than a moment where so much misinformation is spread online. So yeah, I hope you guys have enjoyed. This was kind of a long video, but I think it's a video that was very necessary, and I hope you tune into all my live streams moving forward.